afternoon. My name is Peter Gearin and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Mandarin. Welcome to this special webinar, which we're running to coincide with the Mandarin's official 10th birthday. Thanks for your support of independent media and thanks for attending today's webinar. We've assembled an outstanding panel today to discuss the Australian Public Service then, now and tomorrow. Before I introduce our panellists, I want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I want to pay my respects to all elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their cultures and connections to the land and waters of Australia. Now let me introduce our outstanding panellists. Andrew Podger's distinguished APS career included stints as Secretary at Health and Aged Care, Housing and Regional Development and Administrative Services. He was also Australian Public Service Commissioner from 2002 to 2004. He's now a Professor of Public Policy at ANU and a regular Mandarin columnist. Sue Vardon spent 2 decades at the top of state and federal government agencies, most notably as the first CEO of Centrelink. She was Chief Executive of the South Australian Office of Public Sector Reform and the Departments of Correctional Services and Families and Communities. She was also SA's Public Service Commissioner. Michael Keating is one of Australia's most celebrated public servants, having been Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Finance and Employment and Industrial Relations in the 1980s and 90s. In 1996, Mike was made a Companion of the Order of Australia for services to social, economic and public sector reform. And Verona Burgess is one of Australia's most respected government, business and public service columnists, having earned a reputation at the Canberra Times and the Australian Financial Review, and we've been fortunate to have Verona as a Mandarin columnist since 2017. I'll try my best to allow some questions at the end so that you can put forward what you would like to the panel. All you have to do as the webinar is going is use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. So let's get started. Mike, I just want to ask you the first question. Just this week, Andrew wrote in the Mandarin about what political leaders can learn from previous administrations when it comes to public service reform, notably the Hawke, Keating and Howard governments. What was it like being a senior public servant when big reforms happen, such as following the Coombs Royal Commission and the Reid Review?
I think it's fair to say that I was one of the 2 or 3 leaders of the response to the Coombs Royal Commission and the Reid Report and so on. And I think we had a very great sense of commitment to wanting to make changes. I'm not sure that our predecessors would have had the same commitment. And I think apart from the commitment we brought, I think we also had a real sense of achievement by the end of the 1980s. The main period of reform was the second half of the 1980s. And I think there was a real sense of achievement. Perhaps we flattered ourselves that our ideas were best because we weren't short of critics. Managerialism was criticised heavily by academics mostly, not by public servants.
Mike, while I've got you, how do you view your time at the APS overall?
I really liked it. I did leave. I joined on January the 2nd, 1961, and I was determined to leave as soon as I could. I was bonded as a cadet, but I came back again at the beginning of 1979. And looking back on it, it just provided enormous opportunities. I was lucky, I think. I was in an era that's now seen as an era of reform. But, we just had a real opportunity to push for changes that we thought were good.
Can I just direct the same question to you, Sue? How do you view your time now, not just in the APS, but in public service generally? Maybe Andrew might be able to answer that question.
I'm unmuting. I'm unmuting.
Oh, sorry, there you are, Sue. Sorry.
It's all right. Now, I think the fact that I was a chief executive for 23 years in the public service indicates my attachment to it. I mean, I think that every day in the public service is a better day than a day in the private sector, for lots of reasons, which I won't go into. It's to me, because I come from a service orientation, and I think the capacity to improve service and deliver service to citizens is a great, and to the people of Australia, is a great privilege. When I went to Canberra, we were given the opportunity to create a whole new agency, and so that was very exciting. It was a challenge, and what I saw was breakthroughs. We changed the international banking system. We introduced the voice to record technologies with Telstra, never happened before. And people were very proud of the innovation. Our call centres beat the private sector on every measure, and so on. So there was a great sense of pride and enthusiasm and measurement. My disappointment has always ever been that not every single person that you worked with in the public service wanted you to succeed. And but you have to learn to live with the cut and thrust of that. But it's a fantastic place to work.
And Andrew, tell us about how you reflect on your time.
Some of the words that have been used by Sue and Mike ring with me: the privilege of working with the public service, the great opportunities that are provided. I could be part of a number of big reforms that had made a difference, as Sue was talking about. I was lucky enough to be involved with the family allowances reform, with sole parents pensions, a range of things going right back, right through, including in the health area many years later. Wonderful opportunities, but also a lot of luck. You know, the luck comes with these things a great deal. And some of that luck is the people I was able to work with. I had a very fortunate group of people at every stage of my career that I look back and say how lucky I was to work with those people. They include people like Ian Castles and Helen Williams, Tony Ayres, and Mike Keating, of course. These are great people to work with.
Terrific. And Verona, can I bring you in? What do you see as the most noticeable change you've seen in the APS since you started observing it?
Oh, there are a lot, but I think apart from the big dramatic sort of reforms that these guys have been talking about, I think that a lot happens incrementally in the public service. I would say the thing that I sort of despair about the most, and I mean I would as a reporter, is the cloak of secrecy that I think has got worse and worse and worse, and the fact that the public service as a kind of organism and government as an organism doesn't seem to understand that the more secrecy, the less people trust you. And I think that's at the moment, I think it was a turning point around the on-water matters in about 2004. But I think that's the thing, and the sort of disabling of a lot of the FOI and all of that, and bringing privacy to the sort of primary level, that privacy is everything. Well, it's not actually. Accountability is pretty much everything.
That was the next question, really, Verona, was around, like what ideas from the past remain most relevant today, especially when it comes to things like accountability.
Well, I think that the ethics of the public service are the most important thing. Without ethics, you can have all the best policy and best service delivery, but without, is this the right thing? Are we doing the right thing? What is the right thing? And I think that was something that was obviously lost in robo-debt in the end. And I think so. The ethical foundation. I mean, my father was a public servant, decades ago. He would not bring home so much as a biro. It was just not something that you did. And I think that while that's very kind of old-fashioned in a sense, I think that those ethical things are very important. And most public servants, I think, are really good at being honourable and decent.
Perhaps, Mike, you might want to take that question on as well about the ideas that remain, well, from ideas from the past that remain so most relevant today. Might be on mute. Perhaps while we get Mike off mute.
Oh, sorry, I have.
Oh, there you are, Mike. Sorry. Yes.
I have to agree with Verona about ethics and importance of FOI. I'd probably generalise it a bit more. I think the reforms that were introduced in the 1980s, an underlying presumption was that if we want to get change, we've got to make the information available on the performance of government policies and programs. We've got to, and just generally, you're not going to get people to embrace change unless they can see what's wrong, what needs changing. And but now we seem to have an attitude of cover up. The last thing we want to know is the public to know is what's wrong. And I just think it's incredibly important that we have open government if we want not only trust, but people to make considered judgments about where reform's necessary, where policy changes are needed.
So, Andrew, you produced a very widely read discussion paper in July, supported by 28 former senior public servants, including Mike and Sue. And in it, you made a number of proposals you believe would improve the efficiency, effectiveness, and capacity of the APS, as well as integrity. What would you fundamentally like to see change?
Look, there are a lot of things. Let me start by picking up a couple of things that that Mike and Verona just said. That period, actually, some of it started back in the 70s with the changes with the FOI Act and the administrative law changes at that time. And they were taken a lot further during the 80s with the publication of the forward estimates, with program budgeting arrangements, the approach to accountability for results, evaluation arrangements. Those things were terribly important and very open. And I think that I just pick up particularly the things that Mike and Verona said to contrast that with, we seem to have gone backwards on those things. But we've gone backwards on trying to work out why have we gone backwards. And I think some of it is because while the changes in the 80s did in fact give ministers more power, the arrangement seemed to be in balance, and that balance has been lost. We talk about politicisation. I don't mean appointments of partisan people to the head of the service. I'm thinking more in terms of the level of political control that's required, inhibiting publications, inhibiting evaluations. The role of ministerial staff has shifted from what it was in the 80s, and trying to reverse some of that and correct for that. So the things I'm talking about are trying to rebuild a little bit of that degree of independence of the public service and a bit more of its openness. Part of that is the rewards and penalties. I think we saw through Robodebt, the rewards and penalties were seriously askew. I mean, the person who was most involved with the Robodebt idea got promoted twice. That sense of the penalties for doing the wrong, the penalties for doing the right thing were very clear, because the person who finally called it out, her position was terminated. So trying to get the penalties and rewards back to where they ought to be about what the public service professionally should be doing is a key part. And it's probably the most important of the reforms that I've got to suggest. The way in which secretaries are employed, their appointments process, trying to have them in a continuous employment. If it doesn't work with a minister, they don't get the sack, but they get moved somewhere else to that sense of more mobility rather than total loss of tenure, which I think changes the dynamics and the incentive framework.
Thanks, Andrew. So, Verona, do you have a sense of the things that you would like to see change, if you could, within the APS or about the APS?
I think that I'm of two minds about some of Andrew's suggestions, because I think that while I do think that senior public department secretaries do need some more kind of stability of tenure, I guess. I think they're paid a lot more now. They're paid probably double what most of the people here were earning. They're paid a lot more, and I think that they're quite protected. I mean, the head of the Department of Human Services, even after Robodet had been was clearly a disaster, and all the rest of it, was promoted, as Andrew said, twice. Well, you could say that that person hadn't pleased the new minister and therefore was moved sideways. But, you know, so I think that if you're going to do that, if you're going to offer greater protections, you also have to offer much greater accountability. And I'm not quite sure how that works, because the Public Service Act already has a great long list of things that department secretaries are supposed to be doing, including being stewards, whatever that means. And, you know, how are they held accountable to that, if not through the code of conduct? And the whole thing seems to be a bit of a mess and needs to go back to the drawing board if you're going to give them greater protections of tenure, I think, because they're setting an example for those further down the tree who aren't so lucky as to be paid that kind of money, and who are carrying the can usually when things go badly wrong.
Sue, could I bring you in to talk about this, especially when it comes to how important leaders are when it comes to setting APS culture? I mean, it's obviously, they obviously have a huge role to play, but I'm just wondering, to what extent do you feel that leaders need to be accountable for that?
Two things I wanted to say before. I think that a little bit about from what Mike said. You know, measurement is important. I've been a great fan of measurement. I think everything should be measured and it should be publicly accountable. And I think that we've lost the training inside the public service to understand what it means to be a public service. So that's just to put aside. Now, leadership is everything. I mean, I've spoken often about the language of the leader, and we might as well stick with the Robodet thing because it just sort of consumes everything. When we ran that very important business, the citizens, and we have to be careful because lots of people are not citizens. So the clients, the people that were customers. Once you start using the word and you spit it out, recipients, you know that the shift of the culture has changed. And what happened, just almost that word change demonstrates the culture change in the organization. Instead of the leader being open and encouraging, there were internecine battles and you know, people forgot about who owns legislation. Leadership creates the story, the values, the example. This is the way we do business around here. And if the leader is not demonstrating the way we should be doing business around here, then the organization won't either.
Are you concerned, Sue, that we're not producing enough quality leaders in the APS now? Is that something that can be judged easily by people on the outside?
Look, there are very good people in the public service, and there are just as many potentially good leaders as you would find anywhere, right? But you can't, leadership isn't something your mother taught you. Leadership is something that you develop within your organization. You give people opportunities to move, and you give them good feedback, and you train them, and you give them challenges, and you push them to places where they've never thought that they could go before, and so on. But I think that there were lots and lots of good practices about how to develop leadership that have disappeared. And I think that it's around who's close by, who can we touch, you know, and there are also biases in appointing leadership. I mean, there was work done in the Treasury that said the higher up you go, the less likely are they to take into account the soft skills or emotional intelligence, right? Now, the thing that we have learned about leaders is that you need lots of emotional intelligence. And so that the value of that, I think, still, even though in the past it was worse, I'm still not sure that emotional intelligence is the biggest factor people take into account when appointing leaders. And there's a real rethink about what is valued, what's a valuable set of skills for a leader.
Can I ask you, Mike, the same question around, are we producing enough quality leaders, and also the importance of culture when it comes to leadership? And also, as Sue just mentioned there, this whole idea of, emotional intelligence and other aspects of the softer skills.
Look, I don't think I can add to what Sue and Andrew said. I mean, I basically agree with them. I think, and really what we're saying is that the culture and integrity are incredibly important. But I don't think that on its own will be enough to change. I think we've also got to look at the capability. And I'd have to say I'm not really close to the public service now. I mean, I retired from it over 20 years ago. But my sense is that the capability has deteriorated quite a lot. I think probably I'm less sure about the services. All I know is if I go into Centrelink, I seem to stand forever. When I deal with the staff, they're fine. But when I come to what I'll call the analysts and the policy people, my sense is the capability has declined a lot, and it'll take a lot to restore it. Now, the sorts of things that built capability in my day, and when I first started in the public service, economic policy was made by intuition, a very few people's intuition, and they liked it that way. They didn't have to argue about it with their staff or anything else. But we built up over time. There were enough people involved in economic policy who thought we needed to develop evidence and the skills to use the evidence and so on. And I think that's gone backwards. And one of the things that built it most, I think, that I recall, was when I left the public service, it was mandatory that every program was evaluated on a rolling basis once every 3 years. And it wasn't done by some expert group. It was done by the departments themselves. And it's only when you start to think about, what is the point of this program? What is it trying to achieve? How well is it achieving it, and how cost effective is it? It's only when you've got those sorts of skills and that way of thinking that you can really give good policy advice and manage a program well.
Andrew, can I get you to comment on that aspect of capability?
I basically agree with Mike. I'd make a slightly different aspect of it. I think the pressure of political control and the extent to which we're using consultants and contractors has also played a part. And you see things have moved up the line too much. I mean, I suspect that the public service is recruiting as well as it ever did. It's still getting very bright people to join, very good people with lots and lots of potential, but it may not be developing them as well as it did. And part of that development is giving people authority, testing them, giving them a chance. I can think of times. I mean, I was at the equivalent of an executive level and appeared before parliamentary committee directly. I used to sign the briefs to the Prime Minister as an EL2 equivalent. Being exposed to those sorts of things, and you when you're actually putting your name on the bottom, you want to make sure you're right. You need to do the work around it because you better be right. So I'll do the work. That's part of development. I think there's probably the speed of things have also made things life a bit more difficult for people today than in my day. There was more mentoring. I can remember being mentored very carefully by my SES leaders and helping me with the writing of material and so on. That process of development, I think, is really important. So I'm not suggesting we're not getting really good people in the public service, but whether we're developing them as well as we should be and building that capability and ensuring there is the expertise, those are things that do worry me.
Okay. I was just going to move on to something which is a bit broader than just capability and recruitment issues. It's more about what the role of the APS should be into the future. So how should the APS evolve in the short term, but also in the longer term? Does it need to change its focus? Does it need to become something different to what it is now? Or are we quite happy with it kind of fulfilling the broad role that it does now? Sue, perhaps.
I'm unmuted. Well, this is a terribly exciting question. I just love this question because I've been reading a lot about artificial intelligence, and I listened to the wonderful Stephen Fry say the other day that we're like about the time where the car has just been invented, and we're worried about how many more horses we're going to need, in the city of London. And we didn't imagine the freeways and the highways and the towns and the impact and so on. And I think in lots of ways, we are on the verge of a revolution which may well be almost out of our hands unless we do something about it very, very quickly. And all of the reading that I have seen in front of me says that we've got to change some of the things that we're doing. We've still got to do a lot of imagination, but we've got to use imagination more now than we ever have before, because these learned machines are now making huge changes in the way we do business, in the professions, in everything. And there's an urgency about creative thinking that we need. We need to anticipate a lot more. Strategy is important. Strategy that cannot outsource. It has to be really thought together, but you need to have collective strategy. Terribly important. That there are urgent needs for regulation. Every writer that I said governments must regulate. Otherwise, this artificial intelligence is going to get out of control. And if you want an example of it, you've only got to look at Project 2025 in America, where a group of white, male, rich people want to get more rich and more powers for that group. So what do? They've recommended the change in the public service, closing of the public service, removing the human rights bills and legislations, replacing most public service with their mates. And if you ever want a demonstration about how important public service is to build back the guardrails in our society, you can see that smart people have tried to work out how to disrupt the power of the public service. So the guardrails, the regulation is important now. And then we also got to learn to use it beneficially. We may not necessarily have to invent it, but we need to understand it. We've got to have clever enough people inside our organisations to read the impact of these machine learnings, and to also use it within our own organisation, so that we can work out what jobs can be sent the way of artificial intelligence and what jobs are not. And I can talk about what I think about that, but I've had enough to say just for the moment. But there's an urgency that I don't feel the public service has yet grasped about this huge impact on our world.
Verona, what's your view? Do you have an optimistic view of the future of the APS and all of the issues that it's going to face, including technology, coming to terms with that? Do you feel that that the guardrails kind of are going to be the sort of things that the public service can deliver into the future, which is going to help society? Or do you feel that the APS is going to have to take on a different role?
Well, I think the guardrails are going to have to be set by government, because it's the government that decides the policy. I think that you know, when you go back to administrative law, and one of the principles of administrative law is that a person needs to be making the decision, needs to be the decision maker. You know, that's going to be one of the crucial things with using AI. And if and we need to be very careful that legislation that's brought in doesn't empower a computer to make a decision that cannot be explained by a person. I don't mean that they have to explain the coding, of course they don't, but they have to be able to explain what the decision fundamentally is and why. And I think that cannot be lost, because once you empower a machine to decide what's lawful and what's not lawful, and what's in a sense right and what's in a sense wrong, then all you're doing is relying on this massive input of biased data that isn't going to have imagination in it. It isn't going to have creativity in it, and it's not probably going to have a sense of what's beneficial put into it either, because that's not the nature of the machine, of the information that machines are getting. And so I think that's a big problem. And I think that governments and the public service need to have these guardrails. They need to be thinking about it now. They need to be absolutely building in some sense of flexibility for a future that we don't anticipate, so that we don't get stuck in a past, but which safeguards the humanity of it all. Because that's what it is. It's about people, and it's about what public service and government can deliver for the benefit of the people, and not for the benefit of big business at the expense of the people.
If I can make a couple of comments on that, Peter, and I think the sort of measures that I've proposed in my discussion paper are sort of corrections to reinforce the public service as an institution. And I don't think changes into the future are going to require dramatic changes to those. I think the sorts of changes I've made are the part of the guardrails that Verona and Sue are talking about. There are others as well. If I think about AI more generally, I guess I'm more excited than worried. I think the public service does need to start to think more carefully about what it means. But I look back, we have done this in the past. Thinking about the advent of computers in the 60s, the advent of small computers in the 80s, the internet coming through in the 90s, led to big changes in the way we do business. And over a period of time, enormous changes in the workforce. I mean, if I look back even to 1980, there were what are now APS 1s and 2s, which make up 5%. They were more like 65% of the, over 60% of the public service. And we've lived with that. We've made it happen. No doubt these things are going to have other dramatic changes, but it doesn't change the need for those guardrails and protections of the public service itself. And we're going to need some new guardrails. The things that worry me are exactly what Sue's saying about the need for regulation of these things, and not just regulation within the public service and its use of AI, but out there in the social media world as well. I think there are serious issues for Australia and internationally about how we regulate some of these things.
Because the other aspect of technology too is things like remote working and decentralized staffing, especially when it comes to, not having to necessarily be in Canberra to do the job. I'm just wondering how you all sort of think that will play out. Do you see a decentralized sort of staffing kind of being kind of part of the norm within the APS into the future?
I think there's no doubt there will be more people working from home, and I think the benefits of getting that work family balance right are quite strong. I guess I'm a bit old-fashioned because I still think, particularly as you move to more senior levels, personal contact with others is really still important. You learn a lot from dealing with people face to face, and I'm still uncertain about whether we can really expect technology to totally replace that. I think we do learn much more from meeting people in the corridor, all those things. I don't think they're going to disappear entirely. So, but So I've got some nervousness about those who think that the whole world's going to change and everyone's going to operate from their own home on the social media or whatever it is. I doubt whether that's going to be happening.
Because Sue, it also kind of creates quite a major leadership challenge as well, isn't it? If you've got a lot of your staff not necessarily working from the same office as you, and I'm just wondering how you sort of reflect on that as a potential challenge for leadership in the future.
Well, I'm not a great fan of working from home all the time by everybody. There's a couple of things get lost. Firstly, we're social creatures. If you want to pass a culture around, you can't do it through 10,000 computers. You have to actually talk, inspire. But I think what gets lost is the policy discussion. The people actually get together. It's very hard to work to a group of people who are, I'm not here on Wednesdays, I'm only here on Thursdays, and you can't get me, the days when you could actually call a meeting together and have people have a big conversation about policy have gone. But we need to have I don't know what the jam session is that you can create with this working from home happens. But I think something is lost. And I think there should be some part of everybody that has to join the social thing that's the organisation to pick up on the values. I know of bad examples of people being at home doing decisions about pensions and others where the local police officer popped in and just could you just check the record, the security record for this person. And I mean, I'm not quite sure how you build in all those security protections and so on as well. I think there are big issues with that. But it's the loss of culture that comes from this dissipated diaspora of an organisation. And I think there's great losses in that.
Do you have a view on that, Mike, just in terms of the difficulties of trying to manage staff who are not necessarily working from the same office as you?
Well, I can only agree with Andrew and Sue. I have to say, in my time as a public servant, no one worked from home, so I have no personal experience except in my own case. After I stopped being a Commonwealth public servant, I became head of an organisation that was in Sydney, and I didn't want to spend 5 days a week there, so I had a deal where I could go down for 2 or 3 days and work the other days from home, and it worked, but it didn't work as well as if I'd been there. I'm absolutely sure of that. So I put more emphasis on what Andrew called the mentoring, staff learning from their bosses, but it wasn't helpful me not being there. It worked, but it would have worked better if I'd been there.
If I can add another point, I do think there's been a bit of a cost more widely of people wanting things quickly, immediately, and without the proper careful consideration, whether it be from political pressures or just simply the technology and the media and so on. I look with some dismay at, for example, even our Institute of Public Administration doesn't run conferences where people spend 2 days thinking about things, tossing things around, working things out. I think there are occasions where you really need to have people with the time and face-to-face, chatting things over, working things through to really think things through in some depth. So I do worry that the assumption that we can all do it remotely and on Zoom meetings from time to time loses that sense of, I've got a bit more time to think about it. I can come back on it. I can check with you. That sort of interaction. And if I think of the policy process that have worked best in the past, there's been opportunities for that sort of thing to happen.
I might just quickly move now to some questions that have come through from our fantastic audience today. And one's directed at Mike. It says, in the context of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission and APS review, there's a perception that the independence of the APS is severely compromised. Can you give the rationale for the decision to shift to 5-year contracts for department secretaries, which undermines their ability to show courage?
Okay, I'll have a go. I suspect no one's going to agree with me, but at the time, I chaired the meeting of secretaries that agreed on that. There were two people who disagreed, but I think the consensus was that we weren't giving up anything. That was the consensus at the time. That was the secretaries themselves felt they weren't giving up anything. Now, Andrew's right that most often they were shifted to somewhere else in the public service, but none of us felt we had, well, we were already, the Hawke government had introduced previously, some years earlier, that were appointed for 5 years. And myself, at the end of my first 5 years in finance, they tried to move me, but they couldn't find a suitable job, so they reappointed me for another 5 years. But you actually were appointed for 5 years, starting from the beginning of the Hawke government. And we just felt that we weren't giving up anything.
As Mike says, there is a disagreement on this, in that, yes, two people refused to sign up, but I was amongst those who did write to Mike to say we actually weren't entirely comfortable with this arrangement. And I think that the previous arrangement did mean that at the end of the 5 years, you got another job, another posting. And if things, if you couldn't work out things with a minister, well, of course the secretary must move, but the secretary was moved, wasn't terminated. So I think there were concerns at the time, but I don't think people realised at the time quite how dramatic the change would be. That only became clear in 1996 and subsequently. And I think over time, combined with other things that have occurred, have shifted the context and the rewards and penalties, as I've said before, facing secretaries. And I do think returning to what was there in the 80s and saying, well, let's have a system where there's less emphasis on pleasing. Of course, you've got to be responsive to the elected government, but less emphasis on that and more emphasis on what are your genuine responsibilities and a performance management around those. Seems to me to be where we ought to go.
Thank you. The next question I'd like to ask you all really is around public sector stewardship and what you think that could or should mean. Maybe Verona?
That's a big one, isn't it? Because none of us really quite know what it is that how the Public Service Commission is going to define it when it brings out its definition at the end of the year. It's I'm of the mind with Paddy Gourley, which is to say that for the bulk of the public service, stewardship is a function rather than a value. Actually, it means probably taking, trying to look at the world around you and decide that what you're doing is generally okay. But any public servant below the executive level is really not going to have the power to be able to say, well, I consider in the name of stewardship that this, that, or the other should happen. It's just not feasible. And so I think we're just sort of waiting. The stewardship was already in the Public Service Act for the secretaries. Whether it was even taken into account when looking at the misdemeanours of recent secretaries, I have no idea. Whether it meant anything, until we get some good definitions of it, I think it's a lovely word.
My concern about making stewardship a value is, in addition to what Verona said, is it actually dilutes the importance of stewardship. I think stewardship is hugely important for agency heads. And I think it's probably also very important for the SES. And it is to do with the things that Mike was talking about before, about their responsibilities for the capability of their organisation now and into the future. The capability not only to do what the government of today wants to do, but be have the capability for a new government into the future, be able to face up to those things, to have the systems there, to have the data there, to have the corporate knowledge and so on, have the relationships with academia and elsewhere. Those issues are serious issues of stewardship. And I think by using the word for anything and everything else, you dilute it. Now, the point is, it's now in the Act, so it's there. I just hope, as the Commissioner works out what does it mean for APS employees more generally, it doesn't lose sight of how important it is at that senior management level as seriously about capability.
Sue, do you have a view on the term stewardship?
Look, I'm a simple kind of person, and I have this notion that look, firstly, I agree with Andrew and Verona. I'm not terribly sure what it is exactly, but for me, it was you're given a certain amount of resources, and your job was to maximize those resources for the benefit of society. And you had to look after those resources and be very careful and proper about them. So, for example, my view always was about a human being comes to work with 100% to give. And if you shrink them by putting them in jobs that are not clear, if you shrink them by giving them bullying bosses, if you shrink them by this, you take your 100% of a person and you can take it down to 50. And that is a misuse of taxpayers' money. So stewardship is about how you actually look after your people so that they can give the maximum amount of benefit to society. It's a simple notion, but for me it was you had to release the forces of oppression and release the forces of innovation.
I'll put that on a t-shirt. That sounds fantastic. I'll just move on to the final round of questions, really. What advice would you give, Sue, now that you've got the microphone, someone who wants to start a career in the APS? What would you say to them?
Well, firstly, it's a great place to be. But I would put caveats on it. And I would say, choose where you want to go, move around, experience all the benefits that you can, not for yourself so much as the opportunities until you find a place where you feel really good, and don't stick around horrible bosses. But I'd also put the caution on it. I mean, there are some fantastic public servants now who are doing really hard work, sad work, in mopping up the robo debt and coping with the poor citizens who had such a terrible time. But the bureaucrats are having a hard time too, because they're not being looked after properly. They're being sent out at risk in a sense of, well, if I get a decision, will I be before a Royal Commission again or something? You know, so until the leaders of the public service make it safer for people to be public servants in very difficult jobs, there are very difficult jobs in the public service. Until people make them safer, I would be cautionary about where people go.
Could I frame that question slightly differently, say to you, Sue, to you, Verona, around, do you feel the APS is no longer an employer of choice that it might have been once?
I don't feel, no, I don't feel that. I think that they're able to recruit some pretty smart young people. But what I do think is that there's quite a dissonance going on. I think that a lot of promises are made to young public servants, particularly kind of highly talented graduates who come in, that they're going to make a difference, that this is an exciting career, that there's all this variation. There is, of course, but I would like to say to them that when you start, you're there to learn how to be a public servant. That is the most important thing. You've got to learn how to be a public servant. You've got to learn how to take direction, and you've got to learn to basically be kind of an apprentice for the first few years. And it doesn't matter how many university degrees you've got and how brilliant you might be and how many academic medals you've won. When you join the public service, you have to learn what service is, what public service is, and how to be a public servant. And I don't think that's made clear. And I think some jobs are advertised apart from the graduate intake. You see graduates, and I know young people, I have young, young adult children who are apply for jobs which are completely wrongly described, join an exciting team. And when they get in there, it's data input, and they're immediately crushed and disappointed. So basically tailor the advertising, tell them what it is they're going to be doing when they get in there, and you've got more of a chance of hanging on to the talented ones, I think.
Can I add a couple of things to what Sue's said? And I think, yes, I understand the privilege it is and learn to be a public servant. Move around to find out which job suits, but don't keep moving around. Find a way, because part of your development's got to be to build an area of expertise that you can offer. I mean, one of the my heroes from decades ago once said the best generalist is somebody who's been an expert, who understands expertise is important. So I think for young graduates coming in, building an expertise is useful. But working for the right people. Tony Ayres used to say, good people recruit good people, bums recruit bums. So try to find people who will actually teach you things and help you and develop you is really important. So keep an eye out for the people who you really think you'll learn from.
There's a comment that's been made from one of people listening in talking about hating the term public servant because it's that it's obviously describing what it is to serve the community. But a lot of people, I guess, even within the APS might find the term demeaning and often used in an offensive way. Is there another term that you could use to enhance the work and status of public servants? Maybe Sue.
You're making me laugh. I spent a lot of time labeling jobs so that they did what, instead of being a benefits officer or there's a customer service officer and so on. And I think that maybe if you didn't like the word public servant, you could actually say to somebody what it was that you did. You could say, I'm a this person, or I'm a quarantine officer, or I'm a something or other. You can market yourself with your own language. We are public servants. I've never been worried about being a public servant. I had more trouble being a social worker in government. Maxwell Wilton could hardly believe that I could even call myself one. But I quite enjoyed that. But if you don't like public service, relabel yourself. Tell your friends what you actually do. Call it something else.
Good answer. I'll just finish maybe with this last question, and I'm happy for any of you to take this one on, is will the skills the best public servants need in the future be fundamentally different to the ones that you developed during your career? Mike, perhaps.
Look, I'm not the one to answer this, but my quick answer would be I can't think of any. Obviously, the world's much more digital than when I started my career, but we had digital skills when I was a public servant. I'm not the one to answer it. If I'm just have my sixpenneth worth, going back to stewardship, when I don't think we used the term when I was a public servant, but what we pressed like mad in the era, finance particularly, but tried to inculcate it through the service, was value for money. And I think that's consistent with what the others are saying. I'd also add to value for money integrity. But those two things, to me, are pretty central to stewardship.
Thank you, Mike. Andrew, would you like to take on that question around the skills that are required for the future? Are they any different to the ones that you developed yourself?
Well, I think the answer is in two parts. There will be new skills in terms of the mechanisms one uses, but I think the actual skills of analytical skills or whatever are still going to be there. So you're going to need those skills in the different professional areas that you have to be working with. If you're working in the medical field or working in the legal field or whatever, the sort of skills required, or as just a policy analyst, those skills are going to remain hugely important. But the mechanisms you use, yes, the digital skills will be different, and the, applying AI and so on is going to change the way in which you do it. But I think the basic skills won't change.
Thank you, Andrew. And I think we've run out of time. So thank you very much, Andrew, Verona, Mike and Sue, for your time today. It was a fantastic conversation, terrific. Thank you very much. And I want to thank you all for tuning in today for this webinar. A recording will be available shortly. And if you haven't already, I'd like to urge you to fill in the Frank and Fearless Public Service survey that we've got going at the moment. It closes next Thursday. We'd love to hear from you. All the responses hopefully will give us a clearer view of what you think, and maybe even change some senior management's attitudes and priorities. Of course, all responses will be anonymous, and any information you give us will remain confidential. And best of all, you get a chance to win $1,000 potentially, or if probity is an issue, you can opt out and donate the prize to charity. Anyway, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it, and have a great afternoon.